I want you to imagine the person you love most in this world. Imagine them right now. Imagine their face, imagine their voice, imagine how you feel when you're around them. Now imagine that this person has a weapon in their body with the potential to destroy half the universe, and you can't remove it without killing them. You wouldn't do it, would you? You would scramble to find any other way. But after trying for as long as you can, holding off destruction, you accept that you can't put them above all other life. So you remove the weapon, killing them with your own hands. Think about the sheer agony that would cause you. Then imagine the universe is half destroyed anyway. You killed the person you love, and it was all for nothing. What would you do?
Wanda.
Marvel made a bold move with this show. As a studio that has made its fortune by cracking the code to being as accessible as possible, this is a massive departure from their usual fare. The first 2 episodes have no action and function independently from the MCU as old-fashioned sitcoms. Episode 1 seems to be paying homage to the Dick Van Dyke Show, which I hadn't seen, and episode 2 seems to be doing the same for Bewitched, which I had seen. One's enjoyment of these episodes as their own entities is heavily predicated on how fond you are of shows like that. But what WandaVision does very well is lay the groundwork for something more sinister to be revealed later. But these episodes are not only vital to the show for setup and payoff reasons, they give us a deeply intimate look into the mind of a trauma victim. I don't want to engage in armchair diagnostics and say exactly what ails Wanda, but it's clear that she's suffering from delusions which are likely the result of untreated PTSD. Wanda's mind has created a safe and happy world for herself, and her powers have built it. This show explores not only Wanda's trauma, but the toll it can take on the people around her. Pushing back against the delusion just gets the sufferer to retreat further into themselves, and in this case poses some very real danger, as anyone who threatens Wanda's world is in some way erased or changed, whether she is fully aware of what she's doing or not. These outbursts eventually cause tacit acceptance from those surrounding her. Episode 3 is arguably the weakest of the first 3 from a sitcom perspective. If you want to look at them from a purely comedic angle, you could say that episode 1 is a comedy of manners, episode 2 is a comedy of errors, and episode 3 is a comedy of menace. The whole episode is building and building to this one scene where the laugh track disappears, the aspect ratio changes, and even the way it's filmed shifts. Then the character who helped Wanda deliver the babies mentions something from outside Wanda's delusion.
He was killed by Ultron.
Wanda instantly becomes aggressive, though this time she seems more aware of what she's doing and what has intruded into her space, leading to the show confirming what it's been cleverly hinting to us this whole time.
It's all Wanda.
It may be clever writing or just the natural instinct of comic book fans to make connections, but a lot of things about Wanda pay off here. In Civil War, she's sick of being controlled and makes the choice to only control herself.
I can't control their fear, only my own.
And that is what she is doing here. She is literally controlling her own fear and pain, and as a result, everyone who gets in the way of it Wanda is ordinarily a gentle character until she is pushed to her emotional limits, as seen in Age of Ultron. That is when she is capable of, albeit understandable, viciousness.
Wanda, if you stay here, you'll die.
I just did. Do you know how it felt? It felt like that.
The next 2 episodes still focus on Wanda, but also quite heavily the people around her, and show how her trauma is affecting them. Living with someone who is traumatized or mentally ill is not easy. You can't get angry at them because it's not their fault. They are ill. And it also doesn't help the situation. In episode 5, we see both Wanda and Vision slowly waking up from the delusion. Vision wants to pierce the veil, Wanda doesn't, because she knows how awful the world is out there. If you are a mentally healthy person, you will have problems, but you are more likely to think that the world isn't so bad and reality is always the right choice. So you can't understand why they are so intent on something that isn't real, much less trying to get you to believe it too. Vision points out that much like when a delusion forms, it is unintentional. She is as trapped in it as everyone else. Her mind is holding them hostage, but it's also holding her hostage. She is just the only one with the keys to set everyone free. But she refuses, and that is where your responsibility for your own mental health comes into play. If you are aware of a sickness, it's your job to seek help, but Wanda doesn't want help. This moment of them squaring off against each other is pretty awesome, putting Vision as the person Wanda loves most and the person who is best placed to help. If the first 5 episodes were about constructing Wanda's traumatized mind, from this episode onwards the writers begin to deconstruct it. Vision is now fully out of Wanda's control and he wants to investigate what's going on. This shows us that loved ones who have been previously trying to get closer can often take to pulling away when they can't get through. And now, Wanda is fully aware of her delusion and the physical manifestation of it, even if she's not willing to accept it yet. This is where Pietro comes in. And side note, the reason he looks different was pretty clever. A lot of things this show explains away are pretty clever. Wanda has no one to talk to, but she needs to unburden herself, and the desperation to believe everything is fine allows her to let her guard down. Because she doesn't really believe this is her brother, he feels more like an impartial ear. His confusing behaviour is also explained amazingly well when we find out what he really is, but let's stay on topic. We often don't want to talk to our loved ones in times of crisis because the last thing we want is for our burden to become theirs. In her heart, she knows he's not really her brother, but he doesn't quite register as a threat either, which is perhaps why the facade breaks down when she's around him, and she finally accepts that she is in a fantasy world of her own making, and Pietro carefully lays it out for her without threatening it or bringing the real world into focus. Still, as we see the fantasy that has defined her break down, the real world creeps in. And when faced with losing Vision again, she expands her world and is now consciously refusing to leave it. This continues in episode 7, and the show uses the mockumentary-style sitcom popularised by The Office to show Wanda talking about her troubles but still being evasive. This would be what a lot of people are like in the early stages of therapy, willing to admit that something is wrong but downplaying how serious it is and trying to seek validation from outside sources in an attempt to convince themselves of that. This manifests physically too, as Wanda is losing control of the fantasy. Things keep changing because she no longer knows what she really wants, and she withdraws further as she has no mental energy for her kids or her husband. This episode has a lot of Wanda being pushed to confront the truth and fighting against it. A key scene is where Monica Rambeau says this to her.
And I can't change it. I can't undo it. I can't control this pain anymore, and I don't think I want to.
Which brings me very nicely to talking about Monica. Monica Rambeau presents a really great contrast to Wanda as someone who has managed to deal with their trauma in a reasonably healthy way and is moving forward. Granted, she is not as traumatized as Wanda. She didn't receive any trauma in her childhood. She wasn't experimented on and tortured. But at the same time, it doesn't help to compare who is more damaged. The point is, Monica has managed to deal with her grief in a healthy way. She is clearly still grieving and clearly still dealing with a lot of heavy issues, but she is moving forward. Like when she tries to get back into work and her boss tells her, sorry, you can't just dive back in. She is clearly not happy about it, but she sucks it up and she does her job. And this is very key to Monica as a character and is a very vital contrast to Wanda, who is just so beaten down that she can't move forward. She's standing still. She's going nowhere. I would even go so far as to say it's not so much that she's going nowhere, she is nowhere. And this scene of Monica making her way through the barrier and coming out stronger can be seen as a brilliant metaphor for coming out the other side of trauma. And you can really understand why she wants to reach out to Wanda. She knows how she feels. She lost her mother. She has lost contact with another mother figure in her life. As a soldier, she has likely been through a lot of things that weigh heavy on her, but she manages to pull through and she wants to help Wanda do the same. And I think this makes Monica Rambeau an incredibly likable character. I would like to see more flaws from her, but there is time for that. Right now, she is just the light that Wanda needs to walk towards to get out of the darkness. Now, we get to the episode that broke my heart in all the right ways. And I think the same can be said for Wanda. Confronting everything in this episode broke her heart all over again, but it needed to be done, like resetting a limb to allow it to heal properly. Agnes, now revealed to be Agatha Harkness, a fellow magic user, holds Wanda's children hostage to force her to confront her past. Agatha is doing this because she wants to know how Wanda managed to create a whole world using magic that took Agatha centuries to master on a much smaller scale. Despite being framed as a villain, it's reasonable to see what Agatha is doing here as therapeutic. And once we are through with this, we have seen every painful event of Wanda's life laid out before us. Parents dead, trapped with a bomb for 2 days, tortured and experimented on, brother dead, forced to kill the love of her life, forced to watch him die all over again. And the scene where she goes to see the director, who's been lying this whole time about her stealing Vision's body, is harrowing. I know it is metal and wires, but it really looks like he's being dismembered. And this is obviously further trauma for Wanda to endure. She just wants to give her loved one a funeral and she can't even do that. This is the only goodbye she gets. And I have to give props to Elizabeth Olsen's acting here. Just these words and their delivery say more than anything else ever could. And we finally see the moment Wanda breaks and her mind takes control of her powers. We find out through this episode that sitcom night was a happy activity with her family. Focusing on the sitcom helped her get through being trapped with the bomb. It got her through captivity. It calmed her grieving mind, and it was something she and Vision bonded over. And of course, there is this line, which I will remember for the rest of my life.
But what is grief? If not love
persevering.
The stages of grief are a psychological cliche at this point, and there are flaws in the stages because everyone processes grief differently, and that is what brings me to acceptance, because some people never reach this stage. The most famous and obvious example of this being Bruce Wayne, a man who it can be argued feels all the stages of grief at once, bar acceptance. So it shows that a trauma narrative doesn't have to end with acceptance, but nor do we have to remain battling the other stages either. WandaVision ends with our titular characters accepting the inevitable, but their story isn't over. This series is littered with amazing musings regarding the philosophy of truth. The best one being the thought experiment Vision poses to the reanimated version of himself.
The ship of Theseus is an artifact in a museum. Over time, its planks of wood rot and are replaced with new planks. Is it still the ship of Theseus? Secondly, if those removed planks are restored and reassembled free of the rot, is that the ship of Theseus?
One thing that can be a strength but many consider a weakness of comic book media is the immortality of the characters. This show is very good at explaining away nitpicks people have.
That accent really comes and goes, doesn't it?
But the greatest one they pose is that no character, though they may have the same name and bear the same traits, is ever truly the same. And yet, they are. The love for them remains.
Neither is the true ship. Both are the true ship.
This makes Wanda and Vision's sacrifice at the end mean something and completes the trauma narrative by surrendering the fake world for the more painful but truthful one with more potential. Now, I know this hasn't been like my other knee-jerk reactions, and there's a good reason for that. For those of you who are just joining us, this is a style of review I do where I give an immediate reaction and then I go and think about it. I listen to other people's ideas, other people's critiques, and then I measure how much my opinion has changed. And I mostly talk about conflicting opinions and how I think maybe both opinions are valid, maybe one side's more valid than the other, but I couldn't really do it with this one because my opinion just kept going round in circles with this thing. I started off with the trailer and I thought, oh, they're going to have a villain. I just want this to be Wanda. And then I saw the first few episodes and I kept getting more and more excited and I thought, this is Wanda, this is amazing. And then the last episode. And I couldn't really talk that much about the other opinions I came across because they were very similar to mine, but there are a few points I want to make because I did come across some reviewers who I agreed with their main point, but I think they were being a little bit unfair to the show. And I don't know if these reviewers were just being glib in order to try and be a bit funny, but they contextualize the show as Wanda creating this world because she's sad. She said, oh, she created this world and enslaved a town because she was sad. And I thought, aren't you missing the entire point of the show? And that is why I wanted to structure this video with an essay on the brilliant trauma narrative it had going, because I thought that despite the disappointing final episode, people were being a bit unfair to it and not taking into consideration everything great it had done before. And I know a bad ending can kind of ruin your opinion of a show, but it doesn't cancel out all the good things it did. And it did leave me a little bit frustrated because they said that Wanda did this because she was sad. Weren't you watching the show? Let's go through it again. Parents dead, trapped with a bomb for 2 days straight, tortured and experimented on, brother dead, forced to kill the love of her life, forced to watch him die all over again, died herself, came back, to find that the love of her life didn't come back. And then, to add insult to injury, goes to try and get his body and give him a funeral, only to be told, sorry, you can't do that. Yeah, she did this because she was sad. And because of how much I appreciated the idea that she had initially no control over this, like I said in part 1, it kind of reminded me of Professor X from Logan. Like, he is an incredibly powerful telepath, so if he gets an illness that infects his mind, that is going to make him incredibly dangerous. So it's a similar case with Wanda. She didn't do this because she was sad. She initially had no control over it. But also, I think this is where the show falls down considerably. They missed such a trick here, because once Wanda figures out that she is in this faux reality she created for herself and that she's been holding people hostage, she doesn't let them go right away. She wants to remain in this safe space she's created for herself. And they really should have ran with that instead of trying to position Wanda as the hero for letting everyone go in the end. In the comics, Wanda is such a grey character. A lot of her greyness does come from her involvement in the more violent parts of mutant activism, but she is an incredibly grey character. She is gentle, she is kind, but she's also damaged and can be quite vicious sometimes, and often loses control of her powers, and that is why people fear her so much. I mean, I don't know, I can't count how many times Wanda's lost control of her powers, and that's been a narrative that has surrounded her, and that is a big Marvel problem. I know a lot of the times comics have no consequences, and that has bled into the Marvel Cinematic Universe quite considerably, but they really just stepped on their own idea there. They should have leaned much further into the moral greyness of the situation. They should have said, yes, Wanda is not a bad person. We can understand why she did this, but she's not exactly 100% a hero either. Letting those people go wasn't an act of heroism. It was an act of basic human decency. Fixing the mistake you made, even if you initially made it unintentionally. And even though I was very happy that this world was all Wanda, I did kind of resent that they tried to have a bad guy anyway. It would have been a lot better if Agatha Harkness was, again, not someone who was there to help Wanda, but not exactly a malevolent force either. Just someone who was curious about how Wanda had done this. And the battle wasn't with her, it was Wanda against Wanda. That would have been so much more interesting. And I really wish they had given more moral greyness to the director character, because he was just your standard bad corporate / government guy. There was nothing else to him. They made comments about how Monica didn't have the same perspective as him because she was gone and he was here. He had to deal with the fallout of half the world disappearing. And they could have really leaned into that, and they could have made him a sympathetic character, even though what he is doing is not helping the situation, because, yeah, don't poke the sleeping dragon. They could have made him understandable. He has suffered his own trauma, being left behind. Maybe he lost loved ones in the snap. But no, they just made him generic evil government guy. And that was, again, another disappointing thing, just in an effort to make Wanda seem better. When Wanda was so interesting here, right up until they tried to recontextualize her as a hero. They should have left her grey. And that just frustrated me so much. And I empathise with the frustration of other people who have made comments on this. But I also think they were a little bit unfair to the show as a whole. Because other than that, it was so so good, and I don't want people to forget how good it was, because we need more things like this. And I know Marvel, as it sometimes does, didn't stick the landing with this one, but wow, this was new, it was exciting, it was thought-provoking, it was funny, it was tear-jerking, it was great. Despite how badly it ended, it was great. And I am still excited to see what else Marvel have up their sleeve. Anyway, let's leave this off with measuring how much my opinion has changed. So I wouldn't say 180, I wouldn't say 360 either. I would just say, who the hell knows? My opinion just keeps going round and round with this show. And I think it will keep going round and round. And that's one of the things I think is great about it. There are so many angles from which you can approach this. From a sitcom perspective, from a drama perspective, from a superhero perspective, from a mental health perspective. There are so many ways you can look at it. And that in and of itself is amazing. So my final opinion of WandaVision, it made me laugh, it made me cry, it made me think, and it made me infinitely frustrated. But most importantly, it made me excited about the MCU again. So let's see what else they have up their sleeve.